misunderstanding of the events of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But given the statements made by several decision makers, European decision makers, in a way that this is not the area in which our national interest is existing. So I believe the European decision makers are motivated by their self-interest. If the region is within their national interest, they go ahead, like in the Gulf crisis. But, for example, as said by once, he said that this is not the area we can send our forces to fight. So don't you think that the major sources of this misperception is the ethnocentric, even ethno-religious centric beliefs shaping the belief systems of the decision makers in Europe?
Well, I don't disagree with you about this element of the argument about that this does not concern our national interests. But of course, national interests are not an absolute either-or thing. The world isn't divided into black and white places that are matters of your national interest and those that are not. There is a spectrum, a continuum. And I'm sure it's true that they have deliberately minimized the nature of national interest considerations, that they have played down this matter. But in a sense it was obviously happening in Europe, halfway between one European community country, Greece, and the other European community countries, since it affected the Adriatic, which is a region that NATO has always had a strong strategic interest in, since it created the massive flows of refugees which affected Austria and Germany and Italy and so on. Since indeed the whole justification for the UN interference in Bosnia and the arms embargo is that action had to be taken in order to protect international peace and security. I mean, that is the term in the UN Charter. If they thought it was just an a purely internal affair with no external aspects to it, then they would not have the right under the UN Charter to get involved at all. In all those ways, I think it was obvious and accepted that there were some consequences, some ramifications of national interest. But of course, I agree, they tried hard to play down those aspects. And in the case of America, it's more understandable, I think, not least because the European governments and the European community itself said at the beginning of the war, this is not a matter for America. And there was an extraordinary statement by Jacques Delors, the president of the European Commission, who said, we do not interfere in American affairs. We trust the Americans will not interfere in European affairs. I mean, just an extraordinary thing for somebody to say, standing in Brussels, just 1 kilometre away from the headquarters of NATO, which is the central fact of European geopolitics for 45 years. I mean, but in those circumstances, of course, it was easy for American politicians to say, oh, well, really, this has nothing to do with us. Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Malcolm, for such a deep perception of comment in the area, having a deep knowledge of the historical background in that area. As Muslims, we have very deep concern, and we feel very uncomfortable. The Western world has failed in humanity in supporting the Bosnian cause. And this shows also the double standard of the Western world, where they advertise so much in Europe and in the United States about the Jewish Holocaust, but do not give any support in the Bosnian case. So this do shows the United Nations has become a debating society, not a solving institution. And also, the failure of Boutros-Ghali on this matter, as the United Nations, certain Westerners has to be shamed about this matter. They are also doing the same thing in Chechnya, which is another deep bleeding wound in our hearts. And the Muslim nations, 54 Muslim nations, is behind the Bosnian cause. We as Turks, as the staunch supporters of the Bosnian cause, we want Western world to know this fact. And I do appreciate your comment. The Western world has said Serbia has won the war, now it's a lost war. Now we can accept the status quo as it is. It's a de facto case. So we do not accept that. My second comment to Professor Quran, we do not accept any exchange of immigrants between Turkey and the Muslims, because this has happened in the past after World War I. This is strictly against humanity and international law. The people over there, by coming as immigrants here, I have dealt with many Bosnians and refugees, both here in Turkey and in the United States. They lose their property, they have to learn a new language, they have to adapt a new way of life. This is extremely painful deal to go. Then many of them become psycho cases. This is not any appreciated case. These are the comments that I like to make. I thank the members of the panel for taking this as a good concern. Thank you.
Can I just say, on your first point, I agree about the failure, political and moral failure of the United Nations. And you mentioned Boutros-Ghali. I feel that Bosnia has suffered the worst of both worlds. It has suffered in two opposite ways. On the one hand, you had politicians like that Foreign Office, British Foreign Office official that I mentioned at the beginning, who say, oh well, it's not really part of our world, it's somehow a sort of third world country, it's not really part of Europe. And this affects their policy. On the other hand, of course, you have Mr. Boutros-Ghali, whose attitude towards Bosnia was, at the beginning at least, why are people making so much fuss about Bosnia? It's just because it's happening in Europe. This shows that people are biased towards Europe. We should care more about conflicts in the third world. And he actually, if you remember, he went to Sarajevo and he made a speech which caused enormous offense when he said, well, I can think of 10 other cities in the world that are suffering more than you are. So why is everyone making a fuss about you? So it's thinking they had the worst of both worlds. They had people like this British official in London, and they had Boutros-Ghali for opposite reasons, also saying that they should not, that they did not deserve special help.
I'll go back to some of the remarks here made by great speakers. Why this moral blindness in the West towards Bosnia, when the same West showed such an acute reaction to alleged killing of Bulgarians back in the 19th century? As you well know, or historians would know, back in 1875, 76, there was an upheaval organized by Bulgarian agents in the service of Russia and Bulgaria. They killed some 300 Turks, and the local troops and the local population reacted, and altogether some 2,000 Bulgarians were killed. Well-known story. But Gladstone, who became later Prime Minister on the basis of this accusation in 1880, when he won the elections, accused the Turks, not the Ottoman government, the Turks, of having killed 60,000 Bulgarians. And the name of the title of the book is Atrocious Murder, 60,000 Bulgarians, when we know what happened. But nobody ever tried to find out what was the real reasons. And this is why, in fact, the Russians found the Ottoman Empire isolated and launched an unprovoked war which dismembered the Ottoman Empire. So, more than 100 years ago, there was an outrageous reaction to alleged killings of Christians, whereas now, in the 20th century, there's none of it. So, this is one aspect of the problem, but there is a much graver aspect as far as we Turks and many other Muslims are concerned. The new generation of modernist Muslims and Turks have been raised with a total belief in the universal truth of certain human ideals, respect of human rights, this, that. These were Western concepts which we have adopted and internalized. Now, what Europe does is to betray the very fundamental concepts it has been preaching to the third world for the past 100 or 200 years. Bosnia represents really the undeniable proof that the so-called universal human values actually are relative values that are being utilized periodically for utilitarian purposes by powers who can manipulate public opinion. I see the long-range tragedy of the Bosnian war in the destruction of the very universal human ideals to which we, Muslims and Turks, came to believe as representing common human ideals. So, to me, this local European war is not local, actually. Will have long-range universal implications, pushing many of us away from the very values that we have cherished and which this country, Turkey, had been established upon.
I agree absolutely with that, and you've said very eloquently what a significant betrayal of values this is by the West. On your first point about Gladstone and 1875, of course it's true, as you say, that in that case it was Christians who were being killed, now it is Muslims being killed. Though, of course, don't forget that in Croatia also, in 1991, they were Catholic Christians who were being killed. Yes, I feel it is one element of the Western mentality that there is somehow a difference if only Muslims are being killed. But I don't think that today could be the dominant explanation. In comparing Gladstone with present-day politicians, of course one is comparing very different phenomena. When Gladstone was in Parliament, religion, Christian religion, was still a very strong force in British political life, and that is much less strong today. But of course one big difference between Gladstone and the present political leaders is that Gladstone was a political giant. He was a man of strong principles. He was one of the towering figures of the political history of Britain. Now, when you compare him with the present leadership of Britain or France, there is a basic difference in political abilities, philosophical, moral stature. And I can think of only one person in our recent political history who might have behaved more like Gladstone, and that is Mrs. Thatcher, whose eloquent message was read out this morning. But when one looks at people like her, and then looks at the present leadership in Britain, it's like looking at the difference between a giant and some pygmies.
Question, not a comment. My question is for Linda. Towards the end of your paper, you talked very briefly about the local leadership. Could you please elaborate on that a bit, just to give us an idea as to what type of initiatives, or this particular local leadership that you have in mind, taking? Two, maybe I'm misreading what you said. I'll just ask you a question. Do you see that type of local initiative in small villages providing some kind of an alternative to culturally homogeneous, top-down alternatives and policies? Is there any potential there that's been going on?
I think there is. It's very complex.
I think there is. The picture is obviously very complex, and it depends on what happened before the war and who is actually in power. And in some areas, particularly the kind of Herzegovina, Bosnia, is still under extremist leaders and their poverty. But in central Bosnia, there are political leadership on the Bosnian side and the Croat side do come together and are trying to establish now local council with common governments, coordinated governments, and they are working hard to reestablish confidence. Particularly, the main issue is the return of displaced persons, which is obviously a very complicated issue because in many cases in the homes where these displaced people left, there are now refugees from Serb-held territories who can't go back. So this is creating problems. But there are many areas in central Bosnia where there is a real will to make this federation work. And small steps are being made. But I think we should look at the small steps, and I think in the larger picture these are very positive steps. And as I said, at the end of the day, what does count, and which will count at the end of the day, is that people actually on the ground who used to live next door to each other want to live again. They want to live together again, and they feel that they have been manipulated and misled by some of the politicians. So for me, central Bosnia, there is hope, and I think there is a possibility and there is hope for reintegration of communities again.
Before closing this section, I would like to thank both
Yes, and to all who made interventions to this first session. We will have a coffee break for half an hour, and we will again here at 4:30 p.m. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting the second part of the introductory session to Bosnia War and International Communities. Our first speaker will be Ibrahim Musadia from the University of Sarajevo. His talk will be entitled History of Multiculturalism in Bosnia and the Racist Plan to Divide Bosnia.
Professor Lia is full professor in the Department of Geography in the Faculty of Science and Mathematics of the University of Sarajevo. He has specialized in history and methodology of geographical research, geomorphology, and general physical geography. He has been living in Sarajevo all along and involved with the Union of Refugees. He is a member of the Council of Refugees attached to the Ministry of Refugees in Sarajevo. He will be speaking in Serbo-Croat, and it will be translated from Sicily. Please.
Bosnia, not Serbo-Croat, Bosnia.
Ja ću govoriti novim starim bošnjačkim jezikom. Namjerno.
I was speaking intentionally the old new Bosnian language.
U petak turski ambasador u Sarajevu
Last
pozvao
Friday, the Turkish ambassador in Sarajevo invited me.
Saopštio mi da se u istorijskoj Ankari održava internacionalni kongres ili konferencija posvećena Bosni.
And told me that in historic Ankara, an international conference was taking place dedicated to Bosnia and Herzegovina.
I rekao mi da iz objektivnih razloga ne mogu doći prijavljeni referendum.
And that for objective reasons, the people who were supposed to come couldn't come.
Kad sam ga pitao o čemu bi ja govorio u Ankari,
And when I asked what should I be speaking about in Ankara,
on nam je rekao da govorim ono što sam izložio na jednoj tribini intelektualaca bosanskih muslimana.
he told me to repeat what I said at a meeting of Bosnian Muslim intellectuals.
On se nada da će to kongres primati.
Because he thought that the Congress would like to do it.
Ja sam se probijao iz sarajevske blokade 2 dana.
I spent 2 days getting through the blockade of Sarajevo.
Morali smo proći kroz tunel
I had to go through the tunnel,
i poslije izlaska iz tunela pucali su na nas i poginuo jedan francuski vojnik, francuski uprofor.
and then as we came out of the tunnel, they shot at us, and the French UN soldier was killed.
Ide se po planini Igman,
And then you go along the mountain Igman,
koju također mitradiraju Karadžićevi Srbi,
which is constantly shotted by Karadzic Serbs.
pa se Sarajlije sa svijetom vežu kroz jedan koridor života, kako vi to zove.
So that the Sarajevo people are connected to the life outside, to this corridor of life, as we call it.
Da ne bi dalje pričali o tim epizodama, ja bi se držao naslova.
To cut the long story short, I'll stick to the title in the program.
I onda bih interpretirao istorijsku kartu,
And then I would like to discuss the first historic map.
zatim kartu demografskog, etnografskog i nacionalnu,
Then the national ethnic demographic map of Bosnia.
zatim kartu vlasnika zemlje u Bosni. Čija je zemlja u Bosni? Ko je gospodar grunta? Ko je gospodar zemlje?
Then a map showing the land ownership, the actual ownership of land in Bosnia.
To govorim zbog toga jer smo zajedno sa Hrvatima dobili 51% teritorije Bosne i Hercegovine.
I take this up because together with the Croats we got 51% of the Bosnian Herzegovina territory.
A Srbi, Karadžićevi 49%.
And Karadzic's Serbs got 49%.
Mi pokušavamo da sa ovim mapama, ovim mapama agrarnih,
We want to show with these map showing land ownership.
Pokolebamo kontakt grupu
To persuade the contact group,
koja nam je nametla procente
which would have converted on us percentages,
mimo sve principe etike i morala.
against all principles of ethics and morality.
Mi smo potpisali mapu kontakt grupe na ovoj trećoj karti na zadnjoj.
We have signed the contact group map, which is the last map to the similarity.
Zbog toga da smirimo situaciju, jer nemamo dovoljno efektiva
In order
za rad.
to calm the situation, because we don't have enough argument.
Imamo boraca, dovoljno imamo,
We have plenty of soldiers,
ali embargo nas daje.
but the embargo is strengthened.
Karadžići Srbi nisu potpisali kartu, iako imaju 49%.
The Karadzic Serbs haven't signed this map, although it gives them 49% of the land.
Ako potpišu,
If they were to sign it,
dobit će polovinu Bosne,
they would get half of us.
ali neće moći izići,
But then they will not be able to leave,
što je njima glavni cilj,
which is what they really want,
jer oni su secesionisti.
because they're secessionists.
Osim toga su nacionalisti, šovinisti, separatisti, klerikali.
I don't need to translate this. The nationalists, separatists, chauvinists, and clericals.
Oni eksplicite tvrde da ne možemo živjeti zajedno.
They say quite openly that we cannot be together.
I sve Srbe koji žele da žive u Bosni i Hercegovini sa muslimanima,
And all the Serbs who want to live with Muslims in Bosnia,
nazivaju Alijinim Srbima.
they call them alias Serbs.
To za početak.
This is what we do.
Pa sad da vidimo fenomen multikulturalnosti, multietničnosti, multikonfesionalnosti.
Now let us look at this phenomenon of multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, and multi-confessionalism.
Arheološki podaci i istorijski pisani izvori
Archaeological, historical, and written documents
pokazuju da su na prostoru Balkana, gdje se nalazi Bosna,
show that in the area of the Balkans where Bosnia is located,
kulture se prožimale
the cultures swept into it,
i religije.
vice versa.
Uz jedan uslov.
Under one condition,
Da postoji jedna vrhovna sila ili koncepcija
that the supreme power and conception exists,
organizovana kao država
organized as a state,
koja suzbija separatističke, nacionalističke i ostale divergentne tendencije.
which suppresses national separatism and other diverging tendencies.
To se naročito vidi kroz istoriju,
And this can be seen through this,
pisan, srednji vijek.
particularly in the Middle Ages, where
Za vrijeme srednjeg vijeka, od 10. vijeka do konca 14. vijeka,
in the Middle Ages, from the 10th to the end of the 14th century,
u Bosni je bila jedna jeretička, neomanihejska,
Bosnia had a heretical Manichaean, neo-Manichaean church,
takozvana boguminska,
so-called Bogoman church,
slična albigenzima i patarenima u Italiji, Francuskoj,
similar to the Gentian and Catherine churches in Saudi Arabia,
koja je bila veoma tolerantna ka zapadnoj rimskoj crkvi
which was very open to the Western Catholic church,
i pravoslavnoj, ortodoksnoj, istočnoj, vizantijskoj crkvi.
as well as the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine church.
Za vrijeme maksimalnog teritorijalnog širenja Bosne,
At the time of Bosnia's greatest territorial ascent,
živjele su u miru tri konfesije.
three religions lived together in Bosnia.
Ali se mora reći,
But then one must admit
da susjedi naši
that our neighbors,
na istoku Raška srpska država
to the east, Russia, the Serb state,
i na zapadu utjecaj rimske koncepta, odnosno hrvatske katoličke provenijencije,
to the west, the influence of the Catholic
povremeno su vršili pritisak da Bakarjani, odnosno Albigenzi, nestali. Vođena su 4 krstaška rata protiv Bosanske crkve. Međutim, vladari i vlastela i narod bili su homogeni.
But the rulers and the nobility and the people were together.
Međutim, prodorom Turaka,
With the arrival of the Ottomans,
posljednji naš bosanski vladar, Tomašević,
our last Bosnian king, Stefan Tomašević,
oslanja se na zapad katoličanstvo
he looks for support to the Western Catholicism.
i piše pa
And he writes to the Pope
da mu narod prelazi Turci.
that his people are being converted to Islam.
Da mu narod prelazi Turci. Prelazi i vjer i politiku.
That his people are converted to Islam and accepting the Ottoman presidency.
Zašto?
Why?
Jer je inkvizicija
Because the Inquisition
bila veoma rigorozna.
was very rigorous.
Prije toga Svetosavlje je propalo. Sveti Sava je propalo.
Before that, the Saint Salvador Church just disappeared.
I neomanihejci
These neo-Manichaeans
nisu imali izbora.
had no choice.
Muslimanska vjerska koncepcija
The modern religious conception
nije im branila ispovjedanje neomanihejske vjere.
did not permit the maintenance of this particular neo-Manichaean church.
I nije zabranjivala franjevačke redove, franjevački red.
Did not ban the Franciscan order.
Naprotiv, Fatih je napravio jednu kanonadu, Fatih napravio jednu
On the
preparaciju,
Fatih issued an order
kojom je odobrio Franjevcima ukupan rad.
which allowed the Franciscans to work in
A kao što je poznato, Turci su dozvolili i Pećku patrijaršiju, srpsku,
and as is well known, the Turks, the Ottomans, allowed the French patriarchy.
gro bosanskih seljaka i sitnog plemstva.
The majority of the Bosnian peasantry and petty nobility,
Jedan dio krupnog plemstva
and a section of the upper
prešao je na islam.
to Islam.
Oni su u autokratu.
That is the Ottomans' religion population.
Pravih Turaka je bilo malo.
Actually, ethnic Turks, they're very few ethnic Turks there in this.
450 godina vladavine, turske vladavine, muslimanske turske vladavine,
450 years of Ottoman Turkish rule.
nije bilo seljačkih ustanaka tipa žakerije,
Did not witness present uprising of the kind happening in France.
naprotiv, bilo je više autonomaških tendencija visokog plemstva.
On the contrary, the upper nobility tended to show signs of separation,
To je za feudalizam odmah.
which is typical of normal feudalism.
Tada je bila najviša tolerancija u istoriji Bosne.
At this point in time, this period was the period of highest tolerance.
To je ta tolerancija.
This is the tolerance of which we are.
Čak se pojavila i četvrta konfesija.
And even a fourth confession, religion here.
Judejsko-jevrejsko.
Jewish, Judah and Jewish.
Poslije povlačenja iz Španije.
After they retreat from
Zato imate u Sarajevu 4 crkve
This is why Sarajevo is the four churches,
na 100 metara.
which is 100 meters of each other.
Kad god naši susjedi na istoku i zapadu jačaju nacionalno,
Whenever our neighbors in the east and west grow to strength,
onda im rastu apetiti na internacionalnu Bosnu.
when the appetite towards Bosnia and territory grows,
To se posebno pojavilo u 19. vijeku,
this is especially towards the 19th century,
kad je s jedne strane Turska slabila,
when on one hand the Turkey Ottoman Empire was growing weaker,
a jačao nacionalizam srpski i nacionalizam hrvatski.
and Serb and Croat nationalisms
Tada su mnogi emisari
then many emissaries
ubjeđivali seljake
tried to persuade peasants
da su Bosanci katolici,
that
Hrvati,
Bosnians were Catholic,
Hrvati,
Croats,
a da su Bosanci, pravoslavci, Srbi.
and the Bosnian Orthodox were Serbs.
I to je počelo da poprima izvesne šire zajednice.
And this started to extend this phenomenon of this persuasion.
Time je stvorena jedna novo komponovana situacija
And we arrived at a completely new situation.
koja uvijek hrani disidentstvo, koja uvijek hrani onih što se zove petokolonaža.
Which constantly produces and reproduces fixed costs
Kad su krizne situacije.
in economic crisis.
Ali jedno je izvjesno.
But one thing is certain.
Ako je jaka država,
If the state is strong,
Turska, Austrija,
Turkey, Austria,
a čak i Jugoslavija,
and even Yugoslavia,
i titoizam, onda je relativno zapišno.
then things are relatively calm.
Jasno. Kad se ruše sistemi,
But when systems are falling apart,
onda rastu kogljive nacionalističko-šovinističke tendencije.
then we see growing by mushrooms these nationalist chauvinist tendencies.
To se dogodilo sad.
And this is what happened now.
Kad je pao titoizam,
When Titoism fell,
onda je došlo do centrifugalne sile.
the centrifugal forces appeared.
64% stanovništva,
64% of the
uglavnom muslimani i Hrvati,
mainly Muslims and Croats,
i neki Srbi,
and some Serbs,
glasali su za slobodnu, nezavisnu, suverenu Bosnu.
voted in favor of an independent sovereign Bosnia.
Istovremeno jedinstvenu,
At the same time,
cjelovitu,
integral,
nedjeljivu,
indivisible,
integralnu.
integral.
Sve suprotno od Karadžićevih Srba.
Everything opposite to Karadzic Serbs.
Pošto su imali dobar miraž od jugoslavenske armije,
See, they acquired this great inheritance from the Yugoslav army
jaku logistiku u Srbiji i Crnoj Gori,
and very strong support, logistical support in Serbia and Montenegro
sa asistiranjem Rusije,
with Russia's assistance.
izvršili su državni udar, secesiju, agresiju. Izvršili su agresiju.
They conducted an aggression.
Ujedinjene nacije proglasile su Srbiju, Crnu Goru, Jugoslaviju agresiju.
The United Nations proclaimed Serbia and Montenegro as
Agresiju. 1000 dana,
1,000 days.
traju krvave borbe
The bloody battles are continuing.
i ratni ciljevi svih strana
And the war aims of all the parties
su sljedeći.
are as follows.
Karadžićevi Srbi imali su ratni cilj, zauzeti Sarajevo,
Karadzic Serbs have their war aim at the conquest of Sarajevo.
probit varošicu Bolovo za centralnu Bosnu i presjeći Bosnu po paralelu.
Go to Varšac and Novo into central Bosnia and cut central Bosnia to carve along the parallel.
Probit koridor Tuzli
Break the corridor at Šuška
i probit koridor u Gradačicu.
and also Zagrebac.
I osvoji Bihaćku krajinu.
And conquer the Bihać China.
I za 1000 dana nisu uspjeli.
And they failed to do so in the last 1,000 days.
1993. godine,
In 1993,
poslije godinu dana rata,
after a year of war,
pojavio se secesionizam na zapadu.
we saw the emergence of secessionism to the west.
To je hrvatski nacionalizam.
This is now Croatian nationalism.
Oni su se podvojili,
They separated,
napravili paradržavu
created a parastate,
u 10 opština
made up of 10 municipalities.
imaju oružane snage koje se zovu AVO,
They have armed forces called AVO.
izvršili prepad i napad na jučerašnje svoje saveznike
They took the erstwhile allies
i uspjeli likvidirati stolac stari
They managed
grad,
to destroy the old city of Stolac,
visoravan Dubrave
the capital of the Dubrava,
i desnu stranu Mostarskog regiona.
and the right side of the Mostar area.
Napali Gornji Valus
They picked Gornji Valus
i pokušali u srednjoj Bosni sa udarom u prostoru koji je praktično opkoljen muslimanskim jedinicama,
and tried to
koji je praktično okruženje muslimana. Armija u okruženju do 5 opština. U srednjoj Bosni.
Yes, and they tried to create expanded municipalities in central Bosnia, which are practically surrounded by the Bosnian near the Moldova.
U međuvremenu,
In the meantime,
Karadžićevi Srbi
Karadzic Serbs
su im okupirali četiri grada uz Savu na sjeveru.
4 towns in the north along the river.
Na sjeveru. Onda su izgubili izvjesne bitke tu od Modriče i Dervente.
Then they were battles near Modica and Derventa.
Nisu mogli izdržati u Gornjem Vaku.
They didn't
U
manage
Sušane.
to stay in Gornji Valus.
Nisu prošli gimnaziju u Mostaru.
They didn't go past the gymnasium in Mostar.
I poslije godinu dana odlučili su da pregovaraju.
And after a year, they decided to start
Pod pritiskom Amerike,
under the pressure of the United States.
Franjevaca,
Consistence,
Pape, jednog dijela establishmenta Zagreba.
and one of part of the Zagreb establishment.
Rečeno je
It was said
da prekinemo sa međusobnim
that
borbama,
we should stop this mutual war,
da se vratimo ponovo u zajedničku akciju,
to go back to joint action
protiv početno zajedničkog neprijatelja.
against our initial common enemy.
To se nije svidilo lokalnim poslovima,
The local bosses didn't like this,
pa je moralo doći do smjene.
and therefore they had to give it place.
Odlučeno je da se napravi federacija
It was decided to form a federation
između muslimana i Hrvata.
between the Muslims and the Croats.
Da se udruže 52 muslimanske opštine
To unite 52 mainly Muslim municipalities
i 20 hrvatskih opština
and 20 mainly Croatian municipalities,
i 4 opštine gdje muslimani i Hrvati imaju većinsko stanovništvo.
and 4 municipalities where Muslims and Croats were the majority.
I da to bude federacija.
And that this would then be the federation,
Organizovana kao federacija kantona.
organized as a federation of countries.
Međutim, Karadžićevi Srbi
However, Karadzic Serbs
okupirali su 14 opština
occupied 14
u
municipalities
kojima su muslimani većinsko stanovništvo.
in which the Muslims are the majority population.
A Hrvatima su okupirali 4 opštine,
And they took 4 that kind of municipalities.
tako da se ne može sada federacija napraviti sa ovim brojem.
So that the federation cannot include all the initially French municipalities.
U međuvremenu je napravljen strašan genocid.
In the meantime, a horrible genocide took place.
Milion muslimana je u egzodusu.
A million Muslims are in exodus.
200.000 je mrtvih.
are dead.
Silovano je preko 50.000 žena.
Over 50,000 women have been raped.
Obanovi Hrvati, odnosno Hrvati secesionisti,
The secessionist parts
napravili su genocid u Stolcu,
conducted genocide in Stolz.
Čapljini. To govorim zbog toga što ovdje ima Bošnjaka koji će tu sve. Pa oni znaju, kad ja kažem Čapljina, Stolac, Mostar,
Because he
Kuba i
mentioned these
tako dalje.
places which,
Pa zato nisu.
because our Bosnians in the audience and they're of course they would know.
Naš predsjednik, za skratka, naš predsjednik
Our president
neće potpisati primjer.
would not
To
sign,
produži primjer.
would not extend the current ceasefire
Dok se ne vrate izbjeglice tamo gdje u domestik još uvijek u Svrti.
until the refugees return to the places from which they
I
came.
dok se ne kazne ratni zločinci.
And until the war criminals are punished.
A to znači da će rat biti dug.
And this means that the war will be a long one.
Rekao je sljedeće,
And he said as follows.
da ako Ujedinjene nacije
If the United Nations
ne deblokiraju Sarajevo
do not lift the siege of Sarajevo
i ne osiguraju najmanje 20 km okolo
and ensure a 20-kilometer zone
demilitariziranu zonu,
in demilitarized zone,
probat ćemo sami probiti područje,
then we will break the siege ourselves.
to će biti veoma krvavo.
This would be very bloody.
Mi smo spremni.
We are ready.
I još nekoliko minuta, pošto je ostalo samo neke minute, da objasnim čija je zemlja Bosna.
And I just would take the last few minutes to explain to you whom Bosnia belongs.
Kontakt grupa daje 51% teritorije,
Group gives 51% of
to je ovo. A muslimani sami
otherwise the Muslims on their own
imaju zemlje
own
75%.
75%
Bosne.
of the
Sami, bez Hrvata.
just on their own without the
Sve što vidite ovdje zeleno, tu žive i rade muslimani.
all the green areas are where the Muslims
Sve što je sivo, Srbi.
the grey areas are
Sve što je ova boja lila, kao što prevodi Hrvati.
and the pink areas are Croats.
Također ovo. A kontakt grupa to daje. Sa Sarajevom koje je internacionalizirano isto kao Jerusalim.
Yes, the contact group gives only that part with Sarajevo.
Pošto su Srbi izišli iz Sarajeva. Uglavnom, nisu svi, ali je jedan dobar dio Srba izišli iz Sarajeva.
Good number of Serbs for their Sarajevo.
I dobar dio Hrvata.
As well as a good number of Croats.
Onda će međunarodna uprava biti muslimani.
It is clear that this international administration will be given.
Ali to govorim pežorativno. Biće to onda nekom drugom. Jer pazite, oni nama prave arhipelag državu.
They are creating a state made of like a
Žepa,
yes, it's a
Srebrenica,
Žepa.
Goražde, Sarajevo,
Sarajevo,
Bihać, etc.
and so on.
Mi bi bili kao indijanci u rezervatu.
We will be living like Indians in a reservation.
Mi nemamo izbora,
We have
Nemamo
no
izbora.
other choice
nego da se borimo.
but to fight on.
Za sve muslimane,
For all the Muslims,
specijalno.
especially.
Bosna je fars. Kažete kako ste čuli? Bosna je fars. Znaju muslimani. Da
Bosna
kažu
je
fars.
fars.
Zumne, tako dalje. Fars. Jer je gro armije muslimanske.
Because the majority of the army is Muslim.
I mi imamo dobrovoljce iz 50 zemalja.
And we have volunteers from 50
Ali.
countries.
Ali nećemo da to budu fundamentalci.
But we do not want them to be fundamentalists.
Nećemo to da budu ekstremisti.
We don't want
A
extremists.
ima tendenciju
But there are tendencies
iz počajanja.
out of despair
To je vratno i razumljivo.
in this direction, which is understandable in a war.
Ja smatram,
I believe
ako propadne federacija,
if the federation were to fall apart,
probat ćemo napraviti konfederaciju ili federaciju ili personalnu uniju ili uniju sa Turskom.
we should try to make a federation, confederation, perhaps a personal union with Turkey.
Mi smo turska djeca.
We are the children of Turkey.
Ovdje ima 4 miliona ljudi koji govore bošnjački.
In this country there are 4 million people who speak the Bosnian language.
Ovdje živi 500.000 Bošnjaka oko Smirne.
There are 500,000 Bosnians living around Smyrna.
U nas nema porodice koja ovdje nema roda.
There is no family in Bosnia which doesn't have some relation with Turkish.
Ako će Srbi ići u Beograd,
If the Serbs want to go to Belgrade
Hrvati u Zagreb,
and the Croats to Zagreb,
mogli bi mi na Kosovo.
they went to the Bosnians.
Da bi se moglo pojaviti novo Kosovo.
Then we could have a new Kosovo.
Jer strašna je logistika u Kosovu.
Because Turkey has got...
Sav Balkan, 50 miliona ljudi.
The whole of the Balkans is 50 million.
Turska 60.
Turkey has...
Sav Balkan, 500.000 kvadratnih kilometara.
Balkans 500,000 square kilometers.
Turska 750.
Whereas Turkey is 750,000.
To mi govorimo da bi uplašili neprijatelja Satana.
This is what we say when we want to frighten our enemies.
Jer četnici na televiziji, dakle Karadžićevi Srbi na televiziji,
Because God says, when appearing on courage,
kažu,
they say,
otisnuli smo Turke iz Gora,
they say we push Turks out of Gora.
otisnuli smo Poturice iz Banja Luke.
We pushed new Turks out of Banja Luka.
I nekad kažu muslimani.
Some there is Muslims.
Pa kad već kažu da su potisli Turke,
So when they say they pushed up the
onda je Turska u ratu s njim. Isto.
they did that in Turkey.
Naravno, ovo je sad moja priča. Ne znam jesu li me zbog toga postavili.
I don't know whether this is what they said before.
Ali nama ništa drugo ne treba.
But we don't do anything else.
Osim da nas skinu embargo.
Except for them to lift the embargo.
I da naprave barijeru prema Srbiji samo.
And to put blockade the borders.
Mi mislimo da bi mogli pobijediti.
We think we can do it.
Ako se to ne dogodi,
If this doesn't happen,
postoji opasnost da stvarno budemo država rezervata.
then the danger is that we are going to be a state made of reservation.
Jer nemamo naoružanja teško,
So we don't have sufficient kind of weapons.
a oni imaju.
They do.
Imamo 200.000 boraca,
We have 200,000 soldiers.
ali sa lakim naoružanjem i u kružnoj odbrani možemo izdržati.
But only with right weapons and in the siege situation we can maintain ourselves.
Ali bez visoko sofisticiranog oružja ne možemo izdržati.
But with our
Izići iz ovoga.
more sophisticated weapons we can't break this.
Zato mi sad iščekujemo 1. maj.
This is why we are now waiting for the 1st of May,
To je za nas vrides.
which is for us a decision.
Ili napraviti Bosnu državom cjelovitom, jedinstvenom, nedjeljivom putem rata,
Which is the deciding point. Either we make Bosnia one and indivisible by way of continuing the war,
ili na Ahiret.
or
Na Ahiret. Oni
or
stavljaju
na
Ahiret.
or Ahiret.
Ili na Ahiret. Ili pobijediti, ili bit će igre.
Either win or become commanders.
I hvala vam što ste me slušali, zato sam
Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Satya, for this really impressive presentation. And now we have to conclude with the other speakers. As she is sitting around and she is staying here, I would like to call on Professor Baranka Vargas. Professor Vargas was born in Split, Croatia, where she attended primary and secondary schools. She graduated in the early 1960s and gained a degree in physics at the University of London. For a number of years, she was on the editorial board of the New Review. After Tito's death, she turned to the study of Yugoslav history. In 1992, she published The Destruction of Yugoslavia, to track back up to 1989.
focused on the area of former Yugoslavia and the right wing of Germany. After the start of the war, she helped set up edilmektedir, first the Croatian peace war, then the Alliance to Defend Bosnia and Herzegovina. She is currently the editor of the Alliance's newsletter, Bosnia Report. She would, the subject is, could and or should Bosnia be divided?
As you probably are all aware, Bosnia and Herzegovina started to be divided partition even before the war came to it. Serbia, of course, intended to take the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and for that purpose it began in October 1990 to create a so-called Serb autonomous regions. These were formally united in December 1991 to create the Republika Srpska, the Serb Republic. And then they opened an open military aggression project. We also know, you know, that there were talks between Milosevic and Tudjman about partitioning Bosnia and Herzegovina between Croatia and Serbia. And then came a whole succession of international plans, each more grotesque than others, than the next, for the ethnic partition of a country which in fact cannot be partitioned at all, at any rate not without killing or displacing the majority of its population. And to know why this is impossible, you only need to recall some very basic facts and figures. Bosnia and Herzegovina was by area Yugoslavia's third largest member, after Serbia and Croatia. The former Yugoslavia was roughly the same size as Great Britain, and Bosnia and Herzegovina occupied 1/5 of its territory and contained just about 1/5 of its population. According to the 1991 census, 44% of the population was Northern Bosnia, 31% Serbs, 17 Croats, and then 8 others. Its birth rate in Bosnia and Herzegovina was higher than either Croatia or Serbia, and demographic projections suggest that in the absence of war, by the year 2000, this would have become a country more populous than Croatia and almost as populous as Serbia. The number of mixed marriages, joining together Muslims, Croats, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Jews, was particularly large. Here, of course, more in the towns than in the countryside. And as the society developed and cities grew in size, the number of mixed marriages grew as well. In other words, as time went on, the Bosnian amalgam was growing more and more homogeneous. But of course, it would be wrong to reduce the issue of Bosnian pluralism to the number of mixed marriages. This was a product of a society which grew out of a politically well-defined territory that in one way or another preserved a distinct identity from the 9th century until the present day. The large number of mixed marriages is one consequence of Bosnia's historical political integrity, in other words. Though, of course, as has been said before, the tolerance displayed by the Ottoman state played a very important role. Now, just how pluralistic Bosnia and Herzegovina has been is illustrated by if you look at the ethnic makeup of its 5 largest cities. Those, in other words, with more than 50,000 inhabitants. By the far the largest was Sarajevo, followed by Banja Luka, Zenica, Tuzla, and Mostar. These towns have been growing rapidly. In the decade between 1971 and 1981, for example, the population of Sarajevo grew by 24%, of Mostar by 23%, Zenica 18%, Banja Luka 16%, and Tuzla 13%. And I'm sure that, you know, if the war hadn't come to Bosnia, this kind of prosperity of population would have been maintained, particularly as the country was undergoing a rapid and sustained process of industrialization. Because these towns are the centers of larger municipalities. If you look at the last census, then you have the following ethnic makeup. Greater Sarajevo, 49% Muslim, 30% Croat, 7% Croat, 11% Yugoslav. Banja Luka, 55% Serb, 15% Croat, 15% Muslim, 12% Yugoslav. Zenica, 55% Muslim, 60% Croat, 50% Serb, 11% Yugoslav. Tuzla, 48% Muslim, and the others, non-Muslims, 16% Prague, 15% Serbs, and 17% Yugoslavs. Mostar, 35% Muslim, 34% Prague, 19% Serb, 10% Jews. What is true of these cities, the extent of their ethnic heterogeneity, which is shown by these figures, is true also for others. The percentage would vary from one place to another, but there is no significant urban center anywhere in Bosnia and Herzegovina which did not have a significantly mixed population. And it is against the background of these figures that one can judge the nature of Bosnia and Herzegovina's ethnic pluralism, and by the same token, the implication of the policy of enforced ethnic separation and genocide, which means, in other words, and effectively, a destruction of Bosnia and Herzegovina's urban civilization. It is indeed the purposeful and methodical destruction of urban centers that has given the aggression against Bosnia its particularly barbaric character. Cities are the prime bearers of economic and cultural progress. They play this role not only through what happens inside them, but also because they act as magnets for the rule of people and economy in their immediate neighborhood. If you destroy the cities, in other words, you also annihilate the culture of the countryside. Destruction of Bosnia's ethnic pluralism would amount, in other words, to the de facto annihilation, verge of a past, an urban culture created over centuries, and also of a future, of all that these cities represent to this and subsequent generations of the Bosnian population. A national law of development, linking the cities with their rural hinterland, has been suspended here by this genocidal and herbicidal policy of the aggressor. The ethnic cleansing of cities like Banja Luka, where half the population was non-Serb, or the most majority towns of eastern Bosnia like Zvornik and Visegrad, of Jajce, where before Serbian occupation, the majority of the population was Croat and Muslim, or on the river ports of Bosanski Brod, majority non-Serb, Bosanski Shama, Sito. This was a process that within the space of a few months completely changed not just their ethnic makeup, but also their socio-cultural and economic role. Such newcomers as are there today have arrived not as peasants to become workers, students, or managers. They have come as gangsters, as Serbia's more or less involuntary cannon fodder, or quite simply as refugees from other parts of Bosnia and even Croatia. And in the meantime, of course, at least half of all Bosnians have become refugees, living on humanitarian aid, with little prospect of this dependence ending in the near future. The consequence of a war of this kind, a war aimed at achieving ethnic separation in a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina, does become very clear. In the first instance, it amounts to a significant loss of indigenous population, since its main target of this war has been the civilian population. Civilians have made up over 80% of all victims. This is especially true, of course, among Bosnian Muslims. But the implications go well beyond the fate of this particular generation. The massive social engineering involved in such a genocide amounts to a social and economic catastrophe for the region as a whole. Indeed, the effects of this post-movement of population are difficult to imagine from just looking at the bare figures involved, where the absolute was broken down by ethnic group. Thus, for example, in the area under Serbian occupation, the territory of the so-called Republika Srpska, there lived before the war just over 43% of the total population of Bosnia and Herzegovina, of whom 51% were Serbs, 32% Muslims, and 11% Croats. Today, practically all non-Serbs, and quite a few Serbs as well. That means about half of the population of this whole area, including, of course, its most skilled and educated layers, have been either killed or expelled, or in some other way induced to leave. And if you bear in mind the fact that before the war there were approximately 1,400,000 Serbs living in Bosnia, and that at least 100,000 of these have been killed in this war, while about 400,000 of them have gone into exile, then you can see what this war, waged by Serbia and Bosnia, means for the Serbs of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Indeed, Kraljev's parastate controls which controls now 2/3 of the country, rules over less than half of its original Serb population. As for the Bosnia-Herzegovina Croats, just under half of them, 350,000 out of 3/4 have become refugees, and the number is growing by the day. The attempted creation of a territorial delimited Croat state in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the so-called Herzegovina, of which official Zagreb is so inordinately proud, contains only a minority of Bosnia-Herzegovina Croats. Indeed, while protesting against Serbia's policy of forced deportations of non-Serbs from the occupied area of Croatia, Croatia's President Tudjman has also been busy, quote, drawing borders between civilizations, as he would put it. One city that has had the misfortune to be subjected to such a delineation of civilizational borders is the city of Mostar. The fact that such an enterprise entails destroying much of the city, including its oldest cultural monuments, such as the famous bridge over the Neretva River, is considered to be a minor mishap in the world inhabited by admirers of ethnic separation. Having failed to make Mostar the capital of the Croat Republic of Herzegovina, official Zagreb is now busy dividing what has always been a single city into two ethnically pure and separate municipalities. For his part, Karadzic, having failed to make Sarajevo the capital of Republika Srpska, is dreaming of cutting it up into ethnic ghettos, separated by brick, barbed wire, and minefields. When the last year's ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, asked Karadzic, but how can a city which is nearly 50% Muslim and only 30% Serb be the capital for the Serbs alone? Karadzic had already replied, the city will be divided into Muslim, Serb, and Croat sections, so that no ethnic group will have to live or work together. Zimmerman, just how will it be divided? Karadzic, our vision of Sarajevo is like Berlin when the wall was still standing. In the divided Bosnia-Herzegovina, in which forced partition on an ethnic basis would prevent not a minority, but the majority of its inhabitants from returning to their homes, who would rebuild the country, who would work in the factories, build the fields, reconstruct the previous communication structure, supply the intellectual skills to equip the new generations, or re-establish former trade patterns. The European powers' anti-Bosnian policy was inspired by belief that Serbia will not only win the war, but also will be able to absorb the conquered territories and fashion them into the semblance of an orderly society. And this has been and has proved to be sheer stupidity. It is true, of course, that in the war to date, Serbia has gained over 60% of Bosnian and over 25% of Croatian territories. Its area has doubled in size, and its western borders have moved 300 kilometers to the west. But for 3 or 4 years of occupation of the crucial captures is simply that what we, anybody acquainted with its area, knew in advance, that Serbia is neither economically nor demographically strong enough to make the annexed territories function in any normal way. Serbia's GNP, after all, is just 1/3 of what it was at the start of the war. Economic sanctions have played only a secondary role in this debacle. Their removal would not bring about any necessary economic revival. Even if Serbia were to end the war tomorrow, it would need an estimated immediate inflow of between $2 and $3 billion of fresh capital to maintain the current already very low level of living and restart the modest industrial production. This capital will not be forthcoming. What is more, Serbia suffers from a low birth rate, and the war has led to further dissipation of the population as a result of war casualties, reduced social provision, and inflation. There has not been, therefore, nor will there be any way of Serb colonists into Republika Srpska to replace the extract people. On the contrary, any form of erasure of borders between Serbia and the annexed territories would only produce a new wave of depopulation, this time of Serbs migrating to Serbia in search of work and physical security. It is already clear also that Bosnian refugees in both Serbia and Croatia do not feel themselves at home and are not looked at as nationals of these countries. And of course, if one adds to this picture of what Serbia can achieve, even if it were to sign tomorrow the contract with them, if one adds to the picture of Serbia's difficulties, the following: one, that it still has to resolve national minority problems at home, which of course Kosovo is the most important. Montenegro is by no means pacified. Two, that its government has neglected to conduct any of the reforms, economic reforms, necessary to pilot the country towards post-communism. Three, that the necessary conditions for such reforms to be effective have been destroyed by this war. Then it becomes clear that all those Western states, Great Britain and France in particular, which have counted on Serbia to restabilize the region after its victory, have made bad miscalculations. The growing strength of the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina, determined to win the war and militarily increasingly capable of doing so, is only the final derivation of the basic truth that Bosnia could be ethnically divided only by way of the total destruction of the culture and habitat of all its ethnic communities. And in the light of this, therefore, we should not be surprised by the fact of Bosnia's resilience. The same resilience was shown by Slovenia and Croatia, faced by Serbian aggression. We should not forget, of course, here the incredible resistance of the Albanians or the former Yugoslav province of Kosovo. For the area of former Yugoslavia, and I'll conclude on that, to resume its natural function of evolution, it is essential, first of all, that the Serbian aggressor be thoroughly defeated. Serbia communities, of course, with Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia formed a proper alliance. The Washington Agreement, as we know, ended the war between Georgia, but has yet not given birth to the kind of alliance that is necessary to defeat the common aggressor. I believe that this is something which is very much linked to the internal political situation in Croatia, and that when Croatia comes to be run as a properly democratic state, then all the barriers, final barriers, to achieving a proper unity in action between two states, Bosnia and Croatia, will then be in place, and that in that case, the aggressor will be defeated.
Thank you. Dr. Marcus, that was a very lucid explanation of why the status quo cannot be the positive decision. I now turn to the next speaker, Patricia Forestier. She comes from Paris, from the Commission des citoyens pour les droits de l'homme. She will be speaking on the subject of the use of social sciences to stir up ethnic conflict. Patricia Forestier is a reporter for Éthique et Liberté magazine. She worked for the Bureau de Coordination Sociale in Paris between 1982 and 1986. She then worked for the Social Coordination Bureau of Copenhagen. Since 1992, she has been attached to the Commission des citoyens pour les droits de l'homme, working on Bosnia and researching and publishing particularly on the use of social sciences by Serbian leadership to attain political aims. She is the author of numerous articles in newspapers and magazines such as Express, Éthique, Liberté, François, Le Parisien, Maxi, and Femme Actuelle. She has also contributed to several other European papers, such as the Swedish Medical Journal, the Hungarian News, Pressweek, and so forth. She has recently completed an essay on Bosnia entitled The Mind Behind Ethnic Feeling. That's published in 1994.
No. Do you hear me? I hope my pronunciation is okay. So, today, the suburbs of large cities in France and other European countries are fraught with a siege of smothered ethnic violence. Those living in the heart of these so-called civilized cities lay dead and pretend not to hear the explosions that sporadically occur. Meanwhile, the great powers seem unwilling to extinguish the blaze of ethnic hatred raging in former Yugoslavia. One day, perhaps, like the Bosnians, the children of our Arab suburbs who wish to maintain their traditions and beliefs will be called fundamentalists when they assert their right to their ancestral culture. If not for the huge public protest that arose from all parts of the world, Bosnians would still be regarded and referred to as fundamentalists by the international media as they were in 1992-1993. This was the case in spite of the fact that Slavonic Bosnians were a melting pot where Catholics, Orthodox and Muslims cohabited against the backdrop of atheism left by the outgoing communist regime. Sarajevo was too beautiful, no doubt, and too tolerant to belong to a Europe where most big cities had their ghettos. Seemingly, it was in need of a bit of ethnic carving to put it in tune with the neo-fascism growing at the end of the 20th century. Nevertheless, ethnic carving was almost impossible to accomplish on the soil of Bosnia itself. German anthropologists and psychiatrists had indeed been able to list out the morphological characteristics of Semites and Aryans. However, Yugoslavians could not be categorized according to similar criteria. The only references that could be used to divide them were cultural and religious. And according to the advocates of ethnic zones, these factors determine land rights. One's mind is struck by two aspects of this foreign soil Yugoslavia. On the one hand, the intense hate and violence of the oppressors. These former civilians armed by the Belgrade government, who now exterminate their former neighbors. On the other hand, one is amazed to hear how right they think they are in doing so, and to see that Milosevic has been democratically re-elected. How can this happen at the end of the 20th century in Europe? Hitler was a psychopath. We all know that. But how could millions of people follow him? It is this aspect, this skillful manipulation of consciences that we determine to investigate, document, and expose. Our foremost intention is to help put an end to the war and punish its criminals. But it's also to ensure that no such phenomenon can never happen again in the Europe that we want to build and leave in heritage for our children. A relatively new discipline is developing in our country. It is called ethnopsychiatry and ethnopsychology, meaning psychiatry and psychology applied to the field of ethics. It claims that it helps immigrants adapt to their new countries. However, over the last 10 years, Serbian ethnopsychiatrists have been working at arousing ethnic conflict throughout the entire Balkan territory. We can thus trace back the role played by Jovan Rašković, the Serbian neuropsychiatrist from Croatia. Rašković was a practicing psychiatrist from Šibenik, a city on the Dalmatian coast, near the region of Knin, today under Serbian control. Rašković began to appear on Belgrade television soon after Milosevic arrived in power. Milosevic succeeded in becoming president after waging a campaign in support of the Serbian minority of Kosovo, supposedly threatened by the Albanians there. Rumors of Serbian women being raped by Albanians were actually started in Serbia in the 80s and were intentionally spread to create a psychological effect on the population. These tactics, elaborated by the military psychiatrists in Belgrade, had positive effects on political aims. The Serbs in Kosovo rallied around their local authorities, demanding that more repressive measures be brought against the Albanians. Serbs of Kosovo in danger filled the media in Belgrade, and Milosevic based his entire electoral campaign on positioning himself as the defender and savior of the Serbs. Soon afterwards, Jovan Rašković began to appear on Belgrade television. He was introduced as the most prominent psychiatrist of Yugoslavia, although he had been practically unknown before. He participated in political debates and spoke about ethnics. In 1990, he wrote a paper stating that he had worked as a psychiatrist for almost 35 years on border free states populated by Serbs, Muslims, and Croatians. Thanks to this, he said, he had been able to identify the constituents of these ethnic personalities and their behavior patterns. According to his observation, he declared that the Serb population exhibited the signs of an Oedipal personality. Psychoanalysis makes reference to Oedipus, who was in love with his mother and killed his father, and who fought his father's authority to take his place. Therefore, Rašković adds, Serbs possess authoritarian qualities by nature. He then states that the Croatian personality is linked to a castration complex, that it is close and hermetic, and that deep down it is perpetually influenced by the fear of being castrated, of being struck by someone, of losing something that belongs to it exclusively. On the subject of the potential ethnic conflicts, yes, it is a question of the polarization of the Oedipal personality and the castrated personality. The castrated and the Oedipals can sometimes live in harmony, provided that the castrated, the Croats, recognize the Oedipals, the Serbs, as an accomplished fact and submit. This meant that peaceful cohabitation could only exist if the Croatians remained submissive to the Serbs, the sole possessors of leadership qualities. This type of fallacious argumentation was the basis of the talks Rašković gave on Serbian media under the guise of a great scientist. In 1989, he organized meeting after meeting with the Serbs of Krajina, initially in the Knin area for the most part. The purpose of these meetings was to awaken within the Serbs the sense of their national identity, their ethnic soul, as he called it. He further described what were, according to him, the characteristics of a third ethnic. I observed, he said, that the Muslims are fixated on anal sexuality. This fixation is psychologically characterized by the activity of meditation, the fact of meditating, which is intrinsic to their character. Their personality type has a tendency to appropriate things, to dominate like boss, to value people according to their sex they possess, the money they make, their social status, etc. These theories, inescapably reminiscent of the Nazi anti-Jew campaign, were expounded on by Rašković during political meetings with rural and illiterate Serb populations in Croatia, then later in Bosnia, where he campaigned in 1991 with Radovan Karadzic, another psychiatrist of the same school. Rašković's propaganda in regard to Muslims was later supported by Karadzic's statements. The Serbs and the Muslims, who were previously Serbs that converted to Islam, share the city, Karadzic says. The Serbs used to possess the entire territory, as all of this was one country. It is our country. The Turks were the occupants here, and the Muslims are the successors of these occupants. The campaign waged in Croatia by Jovan Rašković in 1990 was instrumental in stirring up hatred amongst the Serbs and a desire for revenge. In his speeches, Rašković mainly talked about the genocide of the Serbs during the Second World War. He described the horrors committed by the Croats against the Serbs some 50 years before, and spoke of the natural genocidal tendency of the Croatian people. This was the period of the awakening, as it was qualified by Dubravka Čulić, a writer and so-called spiritual father of this new Serbian ultra-nationality. In his book entitled The Time of the Awakening, Čuzić stated that the Serb is the new Jew, the Jew of the 20th century. He is the victim of the same injustices, if not the same persecutions, the new martyred people. He used this propaganda internationally in order to gain the support of important people, such as Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel. In fact, 2 years before the war, Mihailo Marković, a philosopher and sociologist from Belgrade, and ideologist of Milosevic's party, created the Serbo-Jew Association in 1989. The woman at the head of this association was Karadzic, friend. We now know about the concentration camps set up by these leaders. The genocide has now been evidenced. There is only one conclusion possible. These leaders wanted to make others think that the Serbs were the victims, to mislead and confuse everyone, and thus prevent any real understanding of what was truly going on in Bosnia. This propaganda has continued on an international level to this day, in order to prevent active measures in defense of Bosnians. As for the internal campaign to manipulate the Serbs of Croatia and Bosnia, the period of meetings mentioned earlier was punctuated by the exhumation of Serbian skeletons, acts that were turned into veritable media events. This was done to remind the Serbs of the atrocities of World War II and bring the hate and violence of the Ustashi regime back into today's news. As a historical note, the Ustashis were a group of Croatian terrorists who were banned from Croatia, put into power by Hitler. They carried out the Nazi racial hygiene program against Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, and Croatian resistance. The entire campaign in Krajina that gave rise to the outbreak of war was based on making the Serbs believe they were in danger, that they were being attacked and had to defend themselves. Raskovic is the author of a book called Luda Zemlja, which means the Mad Country. It was published in 1990, 1 year before the war began. In it, he explains how hate can be caused to develop between two ethnics when one of them feels threatened by the other and becomes subject to paranoia, which he defines as the obsessive feeling of being persecuted. Therefore, Raskovic could not have been unaware that he would induce extreme aggressiveness and hate in the Serb minority of Croatia by harking back on the horrors of the past and establishing the genocidal tendencies of the Croatian people. At that point, paranoia was heightened by several incidents that were intentionally provoked. An example is one of the first incidents, a decisive one that, according to the Croats, was a true turning point, the supposed stabbing of Miroslav Mlinar, the young president of the Serbian Democratic Party of Benkovic. On May 18, 1990, Mlinar went to the local police, saying that he had barely escaped an assassination attempt and had been lacerated with knife cuts. Although a report from the Federal Ministry of Internal Affairs mentions a small scar of doubtful origin, pictures of Miroslav Mlinar, literally covered in bandages, appeared in the media throughout a period of several weeks, with stories such as the following. After the murder of Miroslav Mlinar's soul and the attack against the Serbs in Croatia, Jovan Raskovic labeled the bankruptcy case a relapse into genocide. Mlinar has received many telegrams of support and get well wishes. Raskovic used this case to create a new wave of hysteria. The knives of the Ustashis are once again on the Serbian throats. At this point, the Serbian civilians of Krajina had all been armed with weapons sent by Belgrade. Raskovic informed Čuzić regularly that the arming was going well. The first blockades appeared in the Knin area, where roads were blocked by Serbs to prevent non-Serbs from entering. 10 Croatian policemen were killed in Borevo Selo. The war had started. The former Yugoslav army, which Milosevic had turned into the new Serbian army, arrived to conquer the coveted territories, intended to become purely Serb. Vukovar was devastated by this army and 3,000 civilians were exterminated. In Bosnia, the Serbian Yugoslav army besieged Sarajevo and other cities. The civilians of Mostar woke up one morning with their town surrounded by the tanks of their own army. The tanks and the army had arrived sometime before to do military exercises around the city, so they said. They had been put up in the town and have settled in the hills around it afterwards. Then one day they began to shell the city. Most of the people could not believe it, nor could they believe that their former neighbors were secretly preparing to exterminate them. This was the first reason of this war. So many lies had been spread between the ethnics by third parties, namely the instigators of the whole issue, that hate and mistrust had taken the place of love and brotherhood. The media played a determining role in the genesis of the conflict. Countless television shows and newspaper articles in Belgrade made allusions to a world conspiracy, inviting the Serbian population to fight for its biological, physical, and intellectual survival. An intellectual from Belgrade made this observation to a French journalist. We have all become a bit stupefied. We can no longer think in a rational manner. We're living in a paranoid universe. Thus, this logic of persecution appears to be more of a strategy than the simple leitmotif of a few individuals. It was indeed very revealing to listen to Bogica Čosić cry genocide when the Croatians attempted to gain back a few positions that had been taken from them by force. Radovan Karadzic's speech upon his return from Athens was very revealing as well. We, the Serbs, are in great danger, he said. Although this plan, that Vansoven plan, is disastrous for the Serbs, we must accept it because, he added, they are stronger than we are. Of course, pleading the cause in this fashion inevitably caused exasperation, and the plan was rejected, in spite of the leader's show of persuasion, pretending to be disconsolate. Karadzic informed the international community of this decision. It should be pointed out that in 1988-1989, Karadzic as well as Rašković attended courses given by English psychiatrists in Zagreb and were trained in group psychology. Karadzic therefore became an expert in handling collective emotions. Karadzic, like Rašković, was a guest at the sumptuous dinners given by Čosić every night in his villa in Belgrade, near Milosevic's home. During these dinners, the Serbian intelligentsia came to listen to the charming words of Čosić, this exceptional writer and speaker. This is how Čosić told his court about Greater Serbia. Actually, much work had been done on the Serbian intelligentsia, resulting in an epidemic of ultra-nationalist intellectuals. The Serbian Writers' Association was a very good breeding ground. Rašković and Karadzic were active members of this association, as well as another psychiatrist called Jovan Striković from Belgrade. Striković is a member of the Serbian parliament, and he is from Milosevic's party. Like Karadzic, he is a Montenegrin who pretends to be a poet. The desire of certain leaders to position themselves as poets was certainly not fortuitous. Through folklore and poetry, they were able to hark back on historical myths and invoke an alleged destiny of ethnic reconquest to rural populations for whom myths had particular significance. Rašković explained that the Serbs had been induced to live without a myth since 1941 and thereafter. And they lived without the myth of Sveti Sava, Saint Sava, without the myth of Kosovo, he said. It was very dangerous and contrary to ideology. As for Jovan Skripovic, he clearly states, it is precisely the myth of Kosovo, given new life by the spirit of Sveti Sava, that reinforces the mental structure of the Serbs, who even after several centuries of slavery under the domination of the Turks, do not forget the ancestral ethics that incite them to sacrifice, oblige them even. The Serbs and the Turks know that the 4S symbol heralds the period of death. They perceive the symbol as the winds that lead the Serbs from the battlefield to the joyful realm of poetry. The use of the word Turks instead of Muslims should be noted here. It is also the word commonly employed by Karadzic with the intention of making an amalgam and reviving resentment related to the Turkish occupation during the Ottoman Empire. In the same way that Kurds are called Ustashis by the Serbian ethnic cleansers, Muslims are called Turks. General Ratko Mladic, Karadzic's right hand, stated to a Spanish journalist, "From now on, my army is in charge of the road to Allah," meaning it is his duty to eradicate all Muslims in the area. In the early days of the conflict, the Balkan president Alija Izetbegovic was often accused of having caused the war due to his desire to create an Islamic state. What has now been created in Bosnia is an Islamic ghetto, so-called Muslim enclaves. In the future, we will speak of the Sarajevo ghetto, the Bijac ghetto, etc., in the same terms that we now speak of the Warsaw ghetto. In 1990, Rašković made a statement in the media, saying that Zagreb and other cities in Croatia were the biggest concentration camps of Serbs in the world. Once more, the Serbian ideologists and strategists accused their future victims of the very crimes they intended to commit. They actually turned the areas they occupied into huge concentration camps with starvation, rapes, and torture, in an attempt to cleanse them by eliminating undesired ethnics. This tactic of accusing the enemy of one's own crimes is continually used by Radovan Karadzic, who regularly announces the Muslim military offensive when he himself is preparing to attack. All criminals are responsible for their acts, whatever rank in the hierarchy they may have. Hopefully, they will all be sentenced by the International War Tribunal War Courts in Den Haag. However, the intention of this analysis is to evidence that the genocide was planned and to stress the responsibility of its leaders and instigators so that they too will be sentenced in Den Haag. We will continue to work in this direction. We believe that the European governments must be bypassed, and that the truth on these atrocities must be made known to international media at the occasion of the War Court trials.
Patricia, for this very interesting analysis, psychological analysis. It reminds me of between Goebbels and the new psychologists using the media and the influence of the society. That also reminds me an area that should be studied, the reluctance of the Western governments, Western public opinion to react to this. I think that is an area that in psychology should be studied, and psychiatry. That reminds me of Albert Wolster's article some time ago when the positioning of the starships and cruises in Europe was involved. He wrote an article, Peace and Bombs, in which he analyzed the position of the church, how influential they were to prevent the government from taking an action that needed to be taken. we come this point. I must thank all the speakers for their very in-depth analysis. On my part, I would like to say a very few words, a very small intervention before we start the discussion. Three basic cardinal points, the cardinal principles of the modern societies have been violated in a very gross manner in Bosnia. Human rights have been violated to the level of genocide. Inviolability of the frontiers have been violated. Self-determination have been counted. And the organizations in Europe to protect these three principles, United Nations, OECD, and NATO, have shown a remarkable degree of inaction or indecision to act. Now, if we ask why they have failed, we have to make this psychoanalysis of the Western societies. Of course, this morning we heard a lot about Islam and Christianity as a reason for this inactivity. Other reasons are also mentioned. One is the element of fear of escalation of the situation into a major conflict. That is, by doing nothing, the European governments really are thinking that the crisis will be contained in Bosnia. Also, another explanation is that power politics within the European context is being played. Britain, France now has accepted to be a medium-sized European power after the Cold War. This is said by French analysts very frequently. But Britain is still to do so. That power politics also has a great game to be played. Now, of course, the Bosnians are left with no choice but to fight to the end if they can. Now, if Europe occurred to my mind today while listening to these discussions, there is also a carrot in the hand of the European Union countries, which might be used with less difficulty, a carrot that they are trying to use in sentence. Why not propose Croatia, Slovenia, and Bosnia membership, early membership in the European Union? And this may persuade the Serbs to come to the play, and that might be an interesting move for them, a carrot lead them to give up chauvinistic ideas and become a European country. That is an idea maybe it's worthwhile to think of. With that, I would like to open the discussion. Those who would like to volunteer. Yes, I see a picture. Please introduce yourself.
Under the propaganda bombardment in Serbia, issues, poetry, history, psychiatry, do you see a possibility of an emergence of an opposition with more moderate elements in the near future?
You mean the opposition in Serbia?
Yes.
Yes, there is an opposition in Serbia.
But do you see a possibility there that there will be more expansion?
Yes, I think they are the hope for Serbia. There is still a hope, but I think there is still always a hope. But they are doing better now than they were in the past 2 years. But they had an extremely hard time because of the Milosevic regime and the oppression. And many of them have left Serbia, many people left Serbia, still there is a group, there are still people opponents to Milosevic regime in Serbia, and they are very active, and they are doing much better now, they are better organized, and I think this is the only life left in Serbia anyway, because the majority of people in Serbia, it's another concentration camps, because they don't have money anymore because they only produce war. That's all they are doing in the country right now. So they're not producing, they are not exchanging, they're not doing anything. And in spite of what Milosevic states that the situation is bad due to the embargo, which is not true, it's due to the war in England. The situation is very bad as well, and this is how Milosevic is very happy with the situation, because basically he controls his population very well. All the people are concerned with this in Serbia right now is to survive, to have something to eat, just maybe a medical population. So this is bad conditions for opposition for sure, but it's going better, and they are growing, and I think now it's a bit better for living too, and I think they will win, because anyway, Milosevic's system and his ideals just leave the Serbian people themselves to death, and to hell, because the people who are coming back from the front, who have committed all these crimes, how can they live with it, It's like, it's crazy. So I think one day or another, it will, with the opposition, it will change, it takes time. So this is the point.
I'm Alan Vogel from the University of California. I'm Alan Vogelquist from the University of California in Los Angeles, and I'd like to make a couple comments in light of the entire discussion that's been going on today, in the morning and in the afternoon. It's occurred to me that the problem with European policy towards Bosnia and the willingness of certain political leaders in Western Europe to accept some of the definitions that have been offered by these mad psychiatrists like Johan Rašković and Karadzic is simple selfishness of representatives of the political elite. I know in the case of the United States, for example, it's not true that most of the informed opinion in the United States is in favor of the current U.S. policy in Bosnia. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Congress and the Senate of the United States, exercising their conscience, have voted several times to lift the arms embargo unilaterally and to supply arms and weapons to Bosnia and to supply air power. And this is what most of the informed people in the United States want to do. But this is not in the calculated political interest of the U.S. president. And if we look at the way that the Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, was selected, he was selected for pure political reasons, for having supported President Clinton's campaign, not because he had an understanding of what's going on in Europe and Eastern Europe and the Middle East in a period of disintegrating multinational empires and communism. He would have done a much better job if he'd named Zbigniew Brzezinski. And as far as the European unity question goes, the reason there's no unity in Europe is because European leaders are acting, each one on their own short-term, selfish political interests, and not seeing the big disaster that this is going to be for Europe itself. So I don't see it as just merely a question of treating Bosnia. This is definitely an element which is being manipulated, and this is a thing which is readily accepted by those politicians who are behaving opportunistically who want the world to forget about what's going on in Bosnia. I just want to say that there are many people in the United States, people like those who have come to this conference, who are not forgetting Bosnia. We will not forget Bosnia. We will not forget Chechnya. We will not forget Tajikistan.
following up your insights into the use of psychology by the Serbs, have you any comments on the, seems to be self-evident, visual evidence that many of the Western mediators or linguists and officials of the UN showed their body language an infinitely happier feeling when they were with Milosevic, or when they were with Putin, or with Begovic. And indeed, of course, although and Martin were on record saying that they think that Milosevic is a great guy. Furthermore, Michael Rose, the British commander in Sarajevo, made the comment that whatever you thought about Mladic, he was at least a real man that you had to fight. The implication being that Muslims and Croats were in some way cystic and didn't know how to defend themselves. And I wonder whether part of what we're seeing with the Western policy is what became known as the Stockholm syndrome. But the more it has become clear that not only has Western policy based on mistaken assumptions, it has in fact become collusive with the consequences of not standing up against obvious aggression and genocidal policies, the more our leaders, particularly people involved in ultra-core and with negotiations and contact groups, find it necessary to blame the victims. The more that the ultra-core intermediating position that has soldiers trained to combat their paying bribes to get humanitarian aid through, which can in fact fueling the war by supplying aid to the Serbian army in practice, the more they have to invent or find catalogues of alternate uses to justify it. And I wonder if particularly at the other members do any comments on psychology of the failure of the international community in the West. How about you manipulate advice?
Well, I think for sure they have to justify this. This is elementary, you know. They have to justify. It's not only psychology, it's public relations. You know, it goes together. They are using psychology for public relations means. And yeah, I think mediators are doing the same, absolutely. In a very hypocrite way. This is what I would say. It's very hypocrite because it's never said. I mean, there would be no problem if they said, okay, we think this and we do this, but what has been putting a lot of confusion and added time has been that these people lie. I mean, they say this and then they do the contrary for weeks and months, and in the meantime, people get killed and horrors continue. So I think this has to be pointed out in the media as much as possible. But when you can speak on media, I know in France it's not very easy. Television, for example, is mainly government lines without Bosnia. So,
my name is Erwin Holder. I'm the Special Political Advisor to President-elect of Cyprus. The reference was made to Cyprus by the chairman. I just wanted to clear the point. In the case of Greek Cypriots, it may be a carrot, the fact that membership in the European Union is offered for Cyprus with reasonable application, actually, a united application. But for Turkey Cypriots, it's not a carrot, it's a stick. And it's a stick in the sense that a unilateral application made by Greek Cypriots on behalf of Cyprus, claiming sovereignty of Turkey Cypriots, is a threat to us, and we don't see it as a carrot, but as a threat.
Hasan Rıza of Bilkent University. I'd like to come back to the earlier question and the comment, which was related about the existence of opposition in Serbia, and I'd like to bring Ms. Branka Magash and ask, if I may, about the opposition, particularly around Belgrade circles and in the metropolitan area. It appears that there has been some kind of an opposition in Serbia, there is no doubt about it. And however, the opposition members, particularly the Civic Alliance people and others, have been really making all these campaigns against the war in Bosnia and what has what the Serbs, and particularly the paramilitary groups in the Serbian army, have been up to, particularly in Bosnia, and to an extent in Krajina region too. But I gather, I've been speaking to a number of civic alliance people and to some other people who may be qualified as the proponents of war in Bosnia, and these are Belgrade Circle people. And I get the impression, when you speak to these people, it is quite clear that they are against the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, when it comes to Kosovo issue, they are more or less, maybe not as vociferous as what President Milosevic and his particular elite and his circle might say, but they are quite sort of determined on the Kosovo issue. So I would really like to hear your comments on that.
Yes, I mean, just to begin with the Serbian opposition. I think you know what has helped to develop Serbian opposition recently, let's say in the last year, was the feeling that Serbia is not going to win the war. This is going to win the war. At the beginning of the war, there was a genuine opposition to German young people who didn't want to go and kill for no obvious, good reason. But as long as it looked after the initial reaction, as long as it was that Serbia would win this war by decision, it was, there was very little. The voices in Serbia were very low. There were people who were always being people who were very little in this war. But partly because they felt that things were not going their way, you know, the international community was accusing Milosevic. They found very disappointed. But now, one thing is getting quite clear that Bosnia is going to survive and this Serbian fighting. The time has come now to reflect, you know, how much longer this music is going to go on. And I think this is now a very interesting situation. A few days ago, a week ago actually, there was a meeting of the Serb Civic Council in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And quite a lot of people came from Serbia, quite a lot of people. And that shows their increasing readiness to engage on the issue of Bosnia with their own government at home. Kosovo is a very special thing, and that is something which is very difficult for those who are not Serbs to quite properly understand. There is no doubt that the issue of Kosovo is built on the very core of Serbian national mythology, and has got this enormous symbolic very important. So that when they say Kosovo, they don't mean what the Albanians mean when they say Kosovo. For Albanians, Kosovo is the place where they live, where they live. For the Serbs, this is a mythical entity, which is quite oblivious to actually have it. I think that this is going to be very difficult for Serbia to face up to. In Bosnia, the war in Bosnia was actually very difficult to justify because nobody really believed that the Serbs in Bosnia were repressed by minority, which is not true. So that it took quite a lot of propaganda and quite a lot of bloodshed to persuade Serbians, if that ever succeeded, that this is a war worth fighting for. But Kosovo is a different issue. It is a different issue. I think that the very discord comes out in Bosnia is the Serbian in Bosnia is going to also determine how the Kosovo Serbian issue is going to be resolved. To put it in a very simply, if Bosnia is partitioned, then we are likely to see a partition of Kosovo. Serbia will talk about a partition of Kosovo. And lots of people who you probably talk to would accept this as a compromise. On the other hand, I don't think that Bosnia would be partitioned. If it hasn't been partitioned by now, it will not be partitioned. The issue of Kosovo is going to remain at the core of Serbian reputation for some time to come. And I find it difficult to realize how it's going to work out. I talked to the Albanian leaders as well, and actually everybody is waiting for the outcome of the war in Bosnia. So Bosnia is in a sense fighting all of our battles in the war between us. The progressive forces in Serbia have vested interest in Bosnian survival, and the same is in Croatia. So this is why for us quite a part of it, and that's extremely important.
U politici su veoma opasne fantazije i iluzije.
Fantasies and illusions are very dangerous in politics.
I liberali, i demokrati,
Liberals and Democrats,
i socijalisti,
and socialists,
i relikti komunisti,
and communist survivors,
i
Zionists,
nacionalisti
and nationalists
u Srbiji
in Serbia.
i Rusiji imaju zajednički imenitelj, a to je front balkanskog sindroma, odnosno balkanskog geostrateškog i geopolitičkog položaja.
They have a common view regarding the geopolitical and geostrategic importance of the world.
Mi smatramo da je to stvar metode.
We believe this is a matter of method.
Jedni provode poštar genocid.
One of these two is conducting parallel genocide,
Drugi exodus.
and the others are the
Treći asimilacija. Oni su kao najblaži.
doing excellence means expulsion, and the third is assimilation, which is the soft, more civilized form of the same thing.
Ima u Beogradu opozicija Miloševiću, ali ne i opozicija položaju srpskog naroda u Bosni.
There is an opposition to Milosevic in Belgrade, but not in regard to the position of the Serb people in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Oni su, kao što kaže, utri u glavu da moraju biti u jednoj državi.
Because they have convinced themselves that they all must be in the same state.
A drugi kako im drago. Mogu i biti u državi i ne moraju.
And for the others, that depends on them. They can have state or not.
I oni zato u svoju ideju prate.
And that's what I'm waging war for this idea.
Ako neko želi da razbije koncepciju, mora je sam prihvatiti.
And if somebody wants to destroy this conception, then they must take up war as well.
Mi smatramo u Bosni, ja i Hrvati, ja,
We and people like myself in Bosnia think that
da su ovoj etapi istorijskog razvitka
in this phase of historical development,
te stvari moraju rešavati oružjem.
these issues must be decided by arms.
1000 dana prošlo od kalkulacija Evrope
1,000 days have gone since the Europe's calculation.
kad god ta Evropa nama nudi rješenja,
Whenever these Europe offers solutions to us,
mi ih predahnemo,
we take it
a onda izgubimo teritoriju.
and then we lose territory.
Još nam dovedu UNPROFOR koji zavisi od politike zemalja koje su
Then they will UNPROFOR, which depends on the policy of the countries which send them in the first place.
Tu postoji samo sad problem, sad je centralni problem nama embargo,
The central problem for us now is the embargo,
jer se borimo na koljenu.
because we are fighting on our knees.
Sve drugo je iluzija samo.
Or everything else is an illusion.
Oni su odlučili da nas unište, a ne pobjede.
They want to destroy us, not to win over us.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. I'm very soon here. Question to speaker Katria was to she explained the psychological preparation of Serbian atrocities which started before the war, and she mentioned that maybe one day in the heart of civilized world, people may call their house communities. Does she spend any preparation for such things there in those part of the Western world?
Will you repeat the question, please? Do you see any preparation for such a move against those minorities in your country or other countries in Western Europe?
You're asking me if I see a shame?
No, preparation.
What is referring to when you said a similar situation in the rise in Western Europe towards the migrant do you see any possibility of any preparation for that?
Yeah, I can see the seeds, yes, for sure. I mean, like northern France and Germany, for example. I mean, you know, a lot of mosques have been burnt recently, and there is this tendency, for sure, which has to be, how to say, erased, you know, which has to be fought now, because we can do it now. And I think there is actually in Europe right now, now that the communism is gone, and this Cold War and all this, it's not like before. There was one side and the other side, and the fight was very clear. Now we have a fight of ideas in Europe, and there is, for example, I can speak about France. There is a big media campaign right now about Islamists, you know, and but in a way, you know, that it creates fear in the people. It creates fear amongst the French people of Islam, and I think this is no good, you know. And so yes, I think we have to be pay attention to what's going on and really work and take positions for tolerance. Yes, absolutely.
Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to close the session, but before doing so, there is an administrative announcement. Tonight at 8 o'clock, there is a reception at the Bilkent Hotel. The host tonight is His Excellency Swami İlişkiler, President of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. All participants, including the chairpersons and invitees, are cordially welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you.